All right, let's dive into some of history's most influential saints. We're talking about 10 incredible people whose stories of faith, intellect, and pure courage have rippled through the centuries, shaping our world in ways you might not even realize. So what exactly made them so legendary? Let's find out.
But first, let's start with the big question. What does it actually mean to be a saint? You know, it's a word we throw around, but it's not just about being a really good person. It's way more than that. It's a formal recognition from the church that someone lived a life that was, well, absolutely extraordinary.
And here's the official breakdown. To even be considered, a person has to check 3 massive boxes. Exceptional virtue, like on another level. Verifiable miracles. And a truly unshakable, unwavering commitment to their faith. I mean, that is a seriously high bar to clear.
So, here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll start with the founders and the great thinkers. Then we'll get into the passionate reformers and some real icons of courage. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at what their legacy really means for us today. And just look at this timeline. It gives you a real sense of the incredible scope we're covering here. We're talking nearly 2,000 years of history, from the very birth of the church in the first century all the way to modern icons who are shaping the world we live in right now.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning with the founders of faith. Think of them as the architects of the early church. These are the 2 people who took a brand new spiritual movement and started building it into the global institution it would one day become. First up, you've got St. Peter. He started out as a simple fisherman, but he was chosen to be the rock on which the entire church would be built. He became its very first leader, the first pope, and he's the one who established its historic center in Rome. And then there's St. Paul, who has one of the most incredible origin stories you'll ever hear. Seriously. He started out as a man named Saul, a fierce persecutor of Christians. But after this blinding, life-altering vision on the road to Damascus, he had a complete and total transformation, becoming the faith's most passionate and tireless missionary.
And this really shows you how they were the perfect team. On one hand, you have Peter, the leader. He was the anchor who set up the church's headquarters in Rome. On the other hand, you've got Paul, the messenger, the dynamic force who took that message and spread it all over the world. One built the foundation, the other built the network. You absolutely needed both.
So, once that foundation was in place, the next big challenge was to build an intellectual framework around it. And that brings us to our next group, the great thinkers. These are the intellectual giants who literally shaped the theology of the faith.
St. Augustine of Hippo was a true titan of the mind. His own journey from paganism to Christianity was this deeply personal struggle, and his writings on philosophy and theology, tackling huge ideas like original sin and grace, they became the bedrock texts shaping not just the church, but pretty much all of Western thought for over 1,000 years.
Now let's jump forward about 800 years, and we meet St. Thomas Aquinas. His special kind of genius was his ability to create this brilliant synthesis, this perfect marriage, of faith and reason. He basically argued that logic and belief weren't enemies at all. In fact, they were partners. This was a revolutionary idea that kicked off a whole intellectual movement.
So you can kind of think of them like this. Augustine is the philosopher of the heart. His work is super personal, exploring faith through his own spiritual journey. But Aquinas, he's the architect of reason. He's building this massive, logical, systematic structure for all of theology. 2 totally different approaches, both completely brilliant.
You know, any institution, even a spiritual one, can start to get a little stale over time. And that's where our next group comes in, the passionate reformers. These folks were spiritual dynamos who saw a need for renewal and just worked tirelessly to revitalize the church from the inside out.
First, there's Francis of Assisi, who is just one of the most beloved saints of all time. He famously walked away from a life of wealth to embrace radical poverty and simplicity. His revolutionary focus on serving the poor and his deep, poetic love for all of creation, yep, including animals, it just ignited this spiritual movement that still inspires millions of people today. Next up, Catherine of Siena. Now, she lived in an era when women were pretty much expected to be seen and not heard. But she became this powerful, outspoken spiritual leader. She fearlessly challenged popes and cardinals, using her immense influence to push for some really critical reforms during a super chaotic time for the church. And then, in 16th century Spain, you have Saint Teresa of Avila. She sparked reform through her profound writings on mysticism, which is really about the practice of having a direct, personal experience of God.
Her legendary descriptions of her own spiritual journey gave her the authority she needed to reform her own Carmelite order, calling for a return to a life of deep, meaningful prayer.
Our last group of saints are what I like to call the icons of courage. These are figures whose faith wasn't just kept quiet in churches or monasteries. Nope, it was put on display through bold, decisive action on the world stage for everyone to see.
And our first icon of courage is the one and only, the legendary Joan of Arc, a young French peasant girl who, believing she was guided by divine visions, led an army to some completely improbable victories during the 100 Years' War. Her story is just a timeless epic of bravery, conviction, and ultimately tragic martyrdom.
Now let's move into the 20th century, where we find Mother Teresa, who became a global symbol of pure compassion. She dedicated her entire life to serving the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta, showing the whole world what radical, hands-on service and love really looked like.
And finally, St. John Paul II. As Pope, he wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a towering figure on the world's political stage. A tireless champion for human rights, he's widely credited with helping inspire the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, starting with the Solidarity movement right in his home country of Poland. So, wow. After that journey through 2 millennia, what's the enduring legacy here? What do all of these stories, when you put them together, really teach us today? I think if there's one huge takeaway, it's this. There is no one-size-fits-all mold for a saint. Not at all. We've seen founders and thinkers, passionate reformers, and courageous warriors. Sainthood is this rich, diverse tapestry of lives, and each one is a completely unique expression of dedication to faith, to service, and to love. And hey, if you're feeling inspired and want to learn more, there are tons of ways you can connect with these legacies. You can actually read their own writings, visit the pilgrimage sites that were so important to them, or take part in the devotions that help keep their incredible stories alive. And that really brings us to the final and maybe most important question. When you look at these incredible lives, these amazing examples of deep faith, sharp intellect, and just unbelievable courage, you have to ask yourself, how can their stories inspire us to take action, not just in our own spiritual lives, but in our world right now? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.